Hi, my name is Haley Haynes-Carstens. I am a student at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I am working on receiving my Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology with a concentration in expressive arts therapy. The title of my presentation today is Stitching Ourselves Together, an Autoethnographic Study of Creative Self-Care to Support Trauma Stewardship. For a little overview of what my presentation is going to contain, I have an introduction of myself and my topic, why this matters with some research. Then I go into my research question and some guiding definitions. I will have a little bit of a personal narrative talking about my own experience with these topics, then going into a discussion of knitting as creative self-care, and then at the very end I will have a list of resources to learn from and my references. Moving on to who I am a baby therapist just emerging into this field as a mental health clinician. I am a 26-year-old queer white female from lower to upper middle class, depends on what life stage I'm in. I've migrated through those. I come from a nuclear intact family, mother, father, and older sibling. I am 50% German, and the other 50% is mixed Northern European heritage, so very strong Northern European genetics. I consider myself to be spiritual, and I have a disability. In addition to my addressing factors, I thought it would be important to also include my expressive arts therapy personal manifesto. This document I created a year ago, prior to my practicum experience and entering this field. The manifesto states to be human first, to always remain authentically curious, to exist with compassionate honesty, to be curious of the power I hold in a space, to remember the freedom that feeling provides, to let myself be held in the same ways I hold others, to inspire creativity in others, and to never neglect the importance of my own creativity. Next, I have a little overview of what my practicum site is, as well as my theoretical orientation. I am doing my practicum at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital in San Francisco, California. It is a 186-bed hospital with 6 different units. In those units, there are 2 intensive care units, transitional care, cardiac transitional care, medical surgical, hematology oncology, bone and blood marrow transplant, and I migrate between all of those different units on a day-to-day basis. I am not isolated to just one. I am supervised by Shalene Hatton, MFT and ATR, and I also work alongside a second trainee and an art therapy fellow who is an associate art therapist. For my theoretical orientation, I draw a lot from existential therapy, and underneath these, I have little references of books that I like to draw from that inform my theoretical orientation. So, Man's Search for Meaning for Existential. I also use a lot of healing centered engagement over trauma informed care. A book that's really helpful is Healing the Soul Wound. Interventions that I use at my site include visual art, mindfulness, non directive play, externalization techniques, and strength based approaches. In addition to those above mentioned points, my personal narrative around experiencing, processing, and living with trauma also informs my daily practice as a therapist. Next, I have a little mind map to just set us up for this presentation. At the hospital, I am working with clients that are actively experiencing trauma. And in addition to that, they might have previous existing traumas as well. And not every patient is traumatized by the hospitalization experience, but a lot of patients are, and especially young kids who might not be able to understand what is happening to them. So I was really interested on this idea, and I'm not going to spend too much on this mind map, so feel free to pause and explore if you would like. But some concepts that I was brewing over as going into this was wondering, what type of clinician do I want to be in this context? Who am I when I am my best self? What does that even look like? What does it feel like? What do I do? If I am holding my clients' experiences, who is going to be holding mine? I knew I was going to need to rely heavily on self-care as a means of survival and engage with emotional processing in my day-to-day. Next, I would think it is important to have some guiding definitions of what trauma is. I have the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration identified trauma as an event or circumstance resulting in physical harm, emotional harm, and or life-threatening harm. Then the APA defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, crime, natural disaster, physical or emotional abuse, neglect, experiencing or witnessing violence, death of a loved one, and more. Then, lastly, the most clinical of these definitions is the lovely DSM, states that trauma is the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others, learning that traumatic events occur to a close family member or a close friend. After those definitions of trauma, I think it is important to discuss trauma stewardship, a concept outlined by Laura Lipsky in her book, An Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others, written in 2009. Lipsky discusses a lot of ways to cope with the traumatic stress that you might be exposed to in your workplace. And I have learned a lot from this book. I highly recommend if you're going into a practicum site or if you currently work with clients who are actively experiencing trauma or have had pretty traumatic past experiences and they are bringing those into sessions with you. This book has really informed me not only how to relate to clients, but also how to relate to myself outside of the workplace and in my professional and personal relationships as well. And in this book, Lipsky outlines what is trauma stewardship. She defines it as a daily process through which individuals, organizations, and societies tend to the hardship, pain, or trauma experienced by humans, other living beings, or our planet itself. And trauma stewardship occurs because you are trying to support the clients that you are working with in the best way that you can. And it might be difficult to achieve trauma stewardship because of the trauma exposure response, which Lipsky also outlines as the transformation that takes place within us as a result of exposure to the suffering of living things or the planet itself. Trauma exposure response is the ways in which the world looks and feels a different place to you as a result of your work. With the previous information in mind from the last slide, prior to entering my practicum site, was contemplating how is this work going to affect me, and whether that is working with clients that are actively experiencing a trauma, or clients that have had trauma in the past, or clients that haven't had any trauma at all. I was mulling over this question and how would I respond, and some guiding quotes that helped spark this inquiry and also my process with it is the first one is, if I am exposed to suffering in a single moment over the arc of time, is there the possibility that I will be affected by such exposure? And then the second one is from Viktor Frankl from Man's Search for Meaning. The size of human suffering is relative to the size of the soul and conscious mind. This quote really makes me remember or think about the relationship between suffering and joy, and pain and joy, and grief and joy, and that the depth of grief is only as big as the depth of joy, and those two have to occur simultaneously. And then lastly, I found a research article that found that empathy and vicarious trauma are positively related to burnout. So this is something that I was keeping in the forefront of my mind as I was entering my practicum site. So, with knowing that empathy and vicarious trauma are positively related to burnout, it is important to highlight some challenges in the field that are known and established. Post-pandemic, mental health clinicians experienced an increase in workload and stress. In 2022, over half of therapists reported feeling burned out, and this number has just been increasing ever since 2020. And it's not isolated to mental health clinicians. Over 63% of physicians report feeling burnout as well. In addition to these feelings of burnout, another challenge is witnessing trauma. Folks are at a higher risk for PTSD following trauma exposure if they are of female gender, lower SES, of a racial or ethnic minority status, if they have a previous history of trauma, if there is a previous history of behavioral disorders in one's family. I found that point to be particularly interesting. And then also if this individual is experiencing a lack of support. So those are all the witnessing trauma factors that will put you at a higher risk for having PTSD following trauma exposure. And if you are experiencing PTSD following trauma exposure, you are more likely to feel burned out in your field. Which brings me to the next point of that there's a significant gap in this research. Therapeutic strategies to address burnout and other work-related conditions are outpaced by innumerable descriptions of burnout prevalence across healthcare disciplines. So there's a lot of research that says this is a problem, but not a lot of research that helps us solve it. And this brings me to my research question. After repeated exposure to trauma, how can knitting support emotional processing? So I think it's important to have a quick discussion about what emotions are. As I was doing this presentation, I myself had to look up what the definition of an emotion was. And the APA defines it as a complex reaction pattern involving experiential, behavioral, and physiological elements. Emotions are processed through the nervous system. This is something that I think is very important, and that they have three different components, which are outlined on this slide. The first one is a subjective experience, a second is a physiological response, and then the third is a behavioral or expressive response. It's also important to note that emotions are the results of an event. You experience an event, and your body will send electrical signals through the nervous system to the brain, and then those signals will produce emotions that are expressed outward. If the event has been experienced before, our brain will take shortcuts to arrive at that emotion. As you can assume, this has significant implications for witnessing trauma, particularly if the individual has previous experiences with the event. And this makes sense why, in the previous slide, folks who have a history of trauma are at a higher likelihood of experiencing PTSD as a result of trauma exposure. Our brain is more likely to jump to these conclusions if it has previous experience. And that basically happens because the brain will interpret signals sent from the nervous system based off of the previous experience. And as the clinician witnesses more and more trauma, those connections will grow stronger. So it's up to the clinician to build those connections in a healthy way and learn to help to properly express their emotions rather than letting them still stay inside and never actually get out. And that can result into unhealthy coping mechanisms. After that, a little bit about emotions, but why knitting? Where does knitting come into this? A quote that from an article that discusses the benefits of arts and crafts states that working with textiles in particular has been found to help in coping with or even neutralizing grief, depression, and personal distress. And those three things, grief, depression, and personal distress, are experienced as a clinician. If you are constantly having the emotional demand upon you of other people's grief, depression, and personal distress, that is most likely going to affect you. The third component of emotions states that emotions must have a behavioral and expressive response, as noted on the previous slide. This can look like a wide variety of actions unique to the individual and could be unhealthy or healthy, as I stated. A healthy one would be knitting. And why is that? Knitting engages multiple senses. So there is input coming from your peripheral nervous system and output coming from your central nervous system. And those things are pretty unique that you can engage both parts of your nervous system while intentionally reflecting on your day or a particular experience with a client. Knitting basically provides a healthy container to assist with emotional processing and maintains body-brain connection, which happens through EMDR like bilateral stimulation. When you're knitting, you are moving one hand and the other hand, usually in a very repetitive motion, which is similar to the bilateral tapping of EMDR therapy techniques. And one study even found that cognition is enhanced with when the body engages use of its hands, and participants exhibited higher learning outcomes as a result of doodling or knitting while learning new information. Restricting hands, on the other hand, inhibits cognition, which I did not know this before doing this project and found that to be very interesting. After outlining the research that supports why knitting is helpful for emotional processing and just for overall betterment in your emotional state and how you're feeling about yourself and cognition, I wanted to go through a little process of the therapist and emotional processing. So this graph starts with the therapist goes to work, witnesses a client in an active trauma state. In witnessing that, the therapist's peripheral nervous system is activated and absorbs information through sensory neurons. Then, after witnessing, the therapist is expected to hold the client's emotions, experience, and energy. This action engages the brain's limbic system, which is part of the central nervous system in the human body. And after this limbic system is engaged, next the therapist has to suppress emotions during the session in order to support the client. The limbic system is engaged, emotions are coming up, they are starting to want to be processed. And as we can remember in our steps of or components of emotions, they get processed physiologically and then they have to exit the body. And so in this moment, when the therapist suppresses emotions, the emotions kind of get stuck in the nervous system. They can't exit through the limbic system. And then the session ends, therapist leaves work. After leaving work is when the therapist has an opportunity to engage in a variety or type of creative self-care. For this example, I am going to continue using knitting. After leaving work, the therapist engages with knitting at the end of the day. This again reactivates the peripheral nervous system that absorbs all of that sensory information, which is the input side of the nervous system. And then while engaging with knitting and engaging with all this nervous system input, in your brain, you can start to reflect on the events of that day. Maybe there was a specific moment with a client that was particularly challenging. Maybe there was a trauma that happened at work that affected you in the moment, but you didn't have the time or space to process those feelings. This knitting provides a container in order for you to process those. And in doing that, you are re engaging the limbic system again. And this is happening in tandem with the peripheral nervous system still being activated. And so the limbic system is the output section of the nervous system, and the peripheral system is input. So in this moment, while reflecting on the day and still engaging in your knitting project, you are using the input side of your nervous system and output side of your nervous system. In doing that, emotions are externalized into your stitches, and this fulfills the third component of emotions. The emotions are expressed. After this, hopefully, the idea is that your connection to self will be reestablished and you'll reach a more level emotional state or be regulated. Now, as we move into my personal process and my personal narrative as how it relates to this project, I wanted to highlight this quote from Rosie Aronson. There is no hearing someone else if we don't know how to connect with who we are. There is no helping someone with an art process if you have not been transformed by one. Here I have highlighted a little timeline of my relationship with knitting. In the early 2000s, I was a little kid and I learned to knit from a friend's mother. Didn't think that much of it, but just enjoyed doing it. Then in my late teens, I started to re-engage with knitting, and I made a couple projects here and there throughout my childhood, but I wasn't really serious about it. In 2020, the pandemic happened, and I turned to art forms that were more easily accessible. This is when I created my first sweater, which is the sweater at the beginning of the timeline. Then in 2022 is when I started grad school. I used knitting to help me stay engaged while listening to lectures online and integrate the material I was learning. And I began to kind of use it as a little wind down tool. Then in 2023, the next year, I began to rely on knitting as an outlet when experiencing moments of distress, and this continued to develop my skills in craft. That 2023 is when I started to make more complicated designs and more complicated sweaters, and I began to really identify, oh, this is a tool that helps my mental health. Then in 2024 winter time, I was going through a rough spot and I really relied on knitting to help me regulate, and I started to make those connections between experiencing heightened emotions and knitting as a tool for emotional processing. I am often someone who has big feelings, and knitting helps me get those feelings out from in me and into something else that then I can set down, walk away from, and pick up when I need it. Then in 2024 September, I moved to San Francisco and I started at my practicum site. This is when a pivoting point started to occur. I began to witness trauma and navigate a new environment as an emerging clinician. I was put into situations that I'd never been put in before. And while I was very supported by my supervisor and peers, it was still a big learning curve. In October and November of 2024, I had a rough realization. I was finding myself just crying on my commute home often, and I wasn't really sure why. I couldn't quite connect my nervous system into my body and figure out what was happening. I just knew that I was having large reactions to what I was witnessing in my day-to-day. And that is when I started to integrate knitting on the bus. And my commute is an hour. I would bring a little side project, and as soon as I got on the bus, I would just start knitting, and the tears stopped. I was still able to process, and gave a it made me stay in my body while thinking about pretty intense topics and experiences that I was witnessing at my practicum site. Then this brings us to now in 2025. This project was born in hopes to share the therapeutic benefits of knitting as supported by empirically validated studies. This, I have my review of things that I've made across grad school. I'm super happy about it. I had so much fun creating this slide. All looking back on my work while in grad school, I can look at each of these sweaters and remember the time I was going through when making them. So they kind of are also little time capsule pieces, and it made me so happy to be able to view them all at the end of this. Then I have some knitting resources. I have Instagram is where I pull a lot of inspiration from, and it's where I find a lot of patterns. I listed some creators that I follow or am interested in, and they often share great resources and great beginner-friendly patterns. And then I also listed some websites for if this is something that you would like to get into. I have video tutorials, where to get yarn. I highly recommend just your local yarn store, and deciding on a project that you're interested in, and then just Googling how to do it. YouTube is a really great resource for this. Then I have a couple pages of references. And thank you so much for watching this presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time and viewing it, and I can't wait to see what happens in the discussion.